He sat alone at the defense table. No briefcase, no tie, just an old blue jacket that hung loosely on his hunch frame and a manila folder clutched between trembling fingers. Walter Peterson hadn't spoken a word since the session began. The attorney across the aisle smirked during his preparations, occasionally glancing over like he was watching a train wreck in slow motion. The judge didn't hide her impatience. The courtroom was stuffy, the kind of overheated space that made people irritable and quick to dismiss. A few spectators in the back row exchanged whispers when the old man struggled to rise from his seat, his metal cane clattering against the wooden floor. The attorney called him unprepared, suggested he was wasting the court's valuable time, hinted he wasn't cognitively fit to represent himself. And the old veteran didn't respond. He just waited, and when his moment finally came, he stood with visible effort, made his way to the witness stand without notes, and quietly placed 2 items on the polished wood, a tarnished silver star, and a letter signed not by a neighbor, not by a lawyer, but by an active duty general still serving. The room didn't laugh after that. They didn't make a sound at all. Welcome to American Stories. Before we dive into this emotional journey, tell us in the comments from which city in America you're watching this video. And don't forget to subscribe to support our channel, because today a disabled veteran will remind a courtroom that respect isn't something you request. It's something you've already earned through sacrifice. This story might change how you see the quiet elderly man at your local grocery store or bus stop. There's often more to people than what meets the eye. The envelope was thin, standard legal paper, creased once down the middle, hand-delivered and taped to the door of apartment 3C. Walter didn't need to open it to know what it contained. He had lived in that building for 19 years, methodically, quietly, always paying rent by check, always on time, until last winter, when the rent jumped by $600 without warning, and his fixed income couldn't stretch any further. The property had changed hands 3 times in 8 months. New owners, new policies, new luxury, branding for a building that still had water stains on the ceiling, a temperamental heating system, an elevator that had been temporarily out of service for most of the past decade. Walter had learned years ago to navigate 4 flights of stairs with his bad leg and a cane, slowly, painfully, but without complaint. He peeled the summons from the door with arthritic fingers and lowered himself into the armchair where he used to sit with Martha before cancer took her 5 years ago. The apartment was nearly silent now, save for the faint ticking of the old military clock and the occasional drone of traffic from the street below. He opened the letter, read it once slowly, then folded it again. Eviction hearing, failure to pay, Thursday at 10 a.m. Walter didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. No lawyer he could afford. No children who'd survived the war. No friends who hadn't already faded into memory or graveyards. He didn't panic. He just reached for the old wooden box on the bookshelf and pulled out a folder wrapped in a rubber band, yellow with age. Inside was everything that still carried weight in his life. His discharge papers, 2 commendation letters, a faded photograph of his unit in Vietnam, and a medal he hadn't touched in years. The next morning, Walter polished his worn dress shoes methodically, working the cloth in small circles the way he'd learned in basic training half a century earlier. Not because anyone in the courtroom would notice the effort, but because discipline was the one thing they couldn't take from him. He found his cleanest button-down shirt, pressed it using the back of a spoon heated over the stove burner, and carefully did up each button with fingers that didn't work as well as they once had. The manila folder went into an inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. He didn't rehearse what he would say. He didn't practice arguments or prepare clever rebuttals. He just checked his reflection in the bathroom mirror, straightened his collar, and nodded once to the empty apartment as he stepped out, locking the door behind it with the key he'd carried for nearly 2 decades. By 9:40, he was standing in line at courthouse security, one leg throbbing from the 6-block walk, his hand steady on his cane, his back as straight as his damaged spine would allow. He was ready not to win, but to be seen. The courtroom was warmer than expected. Walter adjusted his collar as he entered, scanning the space with the methodical precision of a man who had once cleared buildings in a jungle half a world away. He wasn't early, but he wasn't late either. Rows of wooden benches sat half filled with tenants, landlords, and the blank expressions of people waiting for their own moment of judgment. At the front, the plaintiff's table was already occupied. A young man in a tailored charcoal suit, legs crossed casually, one manicured hand tapping at the screen of an expensive smartphone. Alexander Reed had the kind of confidence that came from top-tier law schools and country club memberships, not from foxholes or field hospitals. He didn't look up when Walter entered. He didn't need to acknowledge the opposition. The court clerk called the next case, and Walter stepped forward. He gave his name clearly, navigated around the gate with his cane, and took a seat without fanfare. The wooden chair creaked beneath him. No one offered assistance. No one asked if he needed a glass of water or a moment to arrange his papers. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her machine, waiting. The judge, a woman in her 50s with sharp reading glasses and a perpetual frown, was flipping through a folder without expression. Her nameplate read Judge Eleanor Harmon. She glanced up briefly at Walter, then back down at her papers, her mouth tightening slightly at the corners as if his presence alone was testing her patience. When she spoke, her voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone determined to clear her docket by lunchtime. Case number 47293, Westfield Properties versus Peterson. Eviction proceeding. She looked toward the plaintiff's table. Mr. Reed, you may present your case. Alexander Reed stood with the easy confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to speak in any room. He buttoned his jacket with one fluid motion and approached the bench with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Your Honor, this is a straightforward eviction case, he began, his voice carrying the practiced indifference of routine. My client, Westfield Properties, the current owner of the Beacon Street Apartments, has attempted multiple times to secure payment from the defendant. There has been no substantial payment in over 120 days. He paused, allowing the judge time to make notes. We are seeking immediate possession of property, as well as back rent totaling $3,200. He clicked his pen once, leaned slightly toward the judge, and lowered his voice as if sharing a confidence. I should note that the defendant has chosen to represent himself today. While I appreciate Mr. Peterson's attendance, I'd like the court to recognize that he appears to be unprepared and without proper documentation. We believe any testimony offered without legal support would likely be disorganized and procedurally irrelevant to these proceedings. Reed didn't look at Walter as he spoke about him. His eyes remained fixed on the judge, his expression a perfect blend of professional concern and thinly veiled dismissal. He returned to his seat with the same smooth confidence, crossing his legs and straightening his tie with a satisfied tug. The judge asked Walter if he had anything to submit to the court. He didn't speak right away. His weathered hands opened the manila folder with the care of someone handling fragile memories. The paper inside crinkled softly in the quiet courtroom. He pulled out a single sheet and handed it to the bailiff without a word. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with a buzz cut, took the paper with obvious indifference and brought it to the bench. The judge glanced down at the document, then up at Walter, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. She didn't immediately speak. Walter placed the folder flat on the table again and waited, his posture military straight, despite the pain it clearly caused him. The atmosphere in the room began to change, like air pressure dropping before a storm. The judge stared at the letter longer than expected. At first, her pen continued moving across her legal pad, making routine notes, but gradually the motion slowed, then stopped entirely. She read the page again, then a third time, this time with greater attention. She looked up, but not at Walter. Her gaze found Alexander Reed, who was busy scrolling through emails on his phone, waiting for what he assumed would be a swift ruling in his favor. The judge placed the paper carefully on the bench and adjusted her glasses. The courtroom hadn't fully registered the shift yet. Most people were still mentally elsewhere, thinking about their own cases or lunch plans. But the energy had undeniably changed. The clerk glanced questioningly at the judge. The bailiff, who had barely acknowledged Walter's existence earlier, now watched him with newfound curiosity. Something about this moment didn't follow the usual script of eviction proceedings. The judge cleared her throat and read aloud from the page before her, her voice measured but carrying a new note of respect. This letter, entered into the record by Mr. Peterson, is a commendation from Major General William R. Donovan, dated June 17, 1969, acknowledging extraordinary service during combat operations in Quang Tri Province. It references the evacuation of wounded soldiers under heavy enemy fire and notes decisions that, and I quote, directly resulted in the survival of 14 American servicemen who would otherwise have perished. She paused, looked at Walter, then back at Alexander Reed. This is certainly relevant to these proceedings. Reed uncrossed his legs and straightened in his chair. His confident smile flickered. Your Honor, while we certainly respect Mr. Peterson's military service, we would argue that personal history, however admirable, has no bearing on the matter of unpaid rent. The judge raised her hand, interrupting him mid-sentence. It has bearing, she said firmly. When a man who wore the uniform for this country stands alone in this courtroom with no counsel, and the opposing party refers to him as disorganized and irrelevant, the courtroom fell silent. Now the room that had dismissed Walter 30 minutes earlier was beginning to shift in its collective seat. The gallery grew still, attentive, as if suddenly aware they were witnessing something unexpected. The judge looked again at the letter, then asked, her voice gentler than before, Mr. Peterson, do you have anything else you wish to present to the court? Walter nodded once. He reached into the folder again and slowly withdrew something small wrapped in a soft piece of faded blue cloth. His movements were deliberate, reverent. He placed it gently on the table, unwrapping it with gnarled fingers until a metallic gleam caught the fluorescent courtroom lights. The silver star. This time, no one looked away. The metal caught just enough light to be seen clearly, not polished to a showroom shine, but worn at the edges like something carried more than displayed. It had weight beyond its physical presence. Walter didn't explain it. He didn't launch into stories of heroism or sacrifice. He simply unwrapped it fully and placed it on the edge of the defense table, then carefully slid it toward the center of the courtroom. It stopped halfway between him and the judge, resting in full view of everyone present. For a moment, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. The clerk stopped typing. The bailiff stood perfectly still. The few spectators in the back rows who had come for their own cases now leaned forward slightly, drawn in by the silent testimony of metal and ribbon. The judge lowered her pen slowly and looked at the silver star, as if seeing such a medal in person for first time. Alexander Reed's jaw tightened noticeably. His fingers drummed once against his leather portfolio, then stopped. He looked at the medal, then at Walter, as if recalculating everything about the case before him. The judge spoke, but her voice had changed. No longer procedural, no longer mechanical. It carried the weight of genuine inquiry. Mr. Peterson, may I ask why you brought this with you today? Walter looked at her directly. His voice didn't waver or crack. It was level, dignified, the voice of someone who spoke only when it mattered. Because people forget, Your Honor, and I want to make sure at least one person in this room remembered. He didn't point accusingly at Alexander Reed. He didn't raise his voice or posture like someone with something to prove. He just looked at the judge and waited, his hands folded in his lap. Judge Harmon studied the letter again, then the medal, then Walter's weathered face. She turned toward the plaintiff's table. Counselor, I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach to this case. Reed opened his mouth to respond but found nothing appropriate to say. He looked down at his notes, closed the portfolio slowly, and without another word, stood. He didn't ask to be excused. He didn't thank the court. He simply turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the now silent room. As the door clicked shut behind him, the courtroom, without instruction, without prompting, began to murmur, not in confusion, not in shock, but in quiet acknowledgement. Some people nodded. Others simply watched with newfound respect in their eyes. The bench outside the courthouse was half in shadow, half in sunlight. The concrete seat was warm where it caught the afternoon rays. Walter lowered himself onto it carefully, his cane propped beside him, the manila folder once again secure in his inside pocket. The city moved around him, largely indifferent. Traffic hummed in the distance. Pedestrians hurried past on the sidewalk. Voices carried on the breeze without pause. Walter noticed none of it. His eyes remained fixed ahead, not on anything specific, just forward, like a man who learned long ago to focus on immediate mission rather than surrounding chaos. To any passerby, He appeared no different from any other elderly man resting on a public bench. The uniform was long gone. The medals were tucked away. The courtroom had closed behind him like a chapter ending. But something in his bearing had subtly shifted. He wasn't waiting like someone with nowhere to go. He was resting like someone who had just completed a necessary task. A city bus pulled up at the nearby stop. Walter didn't rise. It wasn't his route. The driver glanced at him briefly through the windshield before pulling away. From the pocket of his jacket, Walter removed the letter again, not to reread it, not to remind himself of its contents, but simply to feel its texture. He ran his thumb across the signature at the bottom, the one that still meant more to him than any judgment ever could. He folded it carefully, returned it to folder, and sat silently for another 15 minutes before standing with measured effort. Walter crossed the street unhurriedly, passing beneath a maple tree shedding its autumn leaves. He didn't speak to anyone, but as he moved down the block, an older man on a nearby bench stood briefly, offered a small salute, and sat back down. Walter acknowledged it with a slight nod, but maintained his steady pace. At the corner, a modest plaque was mounted on a stone wall, partially obscured by years of urban grime. It read simply, "To those who serve, to those who wait." Walter paused, not to read it. He already knew what it said, but to remember what it meant. Then he turned and continued on his way. Some medals aren't worn on uniforms. They're carried quietly, wrapped in soft cloth, tucked in side drawers, resting between letters seldom read. Not because they've lost significance, but because the world rarely asks what they ever meant in the first place. Walter Peterson didn't walk into that courtroom to fight. He entered to remind, not with anger, not with legal jargon, but with the only tools remaining to him, memory, dignity, and a piece of silver earned in a place no one in that courtroom had ever seen. They dismissed him because they thought they understood the story. Another elderly tenant, another delay, another stubborn old man too proud to accept help. What they failed to see, until it was laid bare in silence, was the depth of character standing before them. That silver star didn't win his case. It simply made everyone realize what kind of man they were attempting to displace. In a world obsessed with credentials, with titles, with polished arguments and designer suits, Walter reminded everyone present that true authority doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives in the form of an old man who sits quietly, waits patiently, and when finally given his moment to speak, doesn't raise his voice. He raises the truth. What would you have done in Walter's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance, only to discover hidden depths of character and courage? We'd love to hear your stories of respect earned the hard way. If this veteran's quiet dignity inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of everyday heroes standing their ground. Because respect isn't always given freely. Sometimes it must be gently, firmly reclaimed. From which American city are you watching? Let us know in the comments section below.